Why antidepressants can't fix a life that's fundamentally wrong for you. There's a particular kind of despair that no pill can touch. It's the despair of waking up in a life that fits you like borrowed clothes, technically functional, but profoundly uncomfortable. You take your medication religiously, the sertraline, the escitalopram, the bupropion. You feel the edges of your anxiety soften, the worst depths of your depression lift slightly, like a fog thinning but never fully clearing. And yet, something remains fundamentally wrong. Here's the paradox that millions face but few dare to speak aloud. What if the depression isn't the problem? What if it's the messenger? Imagine your psyche as an ancient alarm system, refined over millennia to detect not just external dangers, but internal ones, betrayals of the self, abandonments of your authentic nature, violations of your soul's architecture. What if that persistent heaviness you feel, that exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure, that vague sense of being trapped in the wrong life? What if these aren't malfunctions at all, but accurate responses to a genuine crisis? The uncomfortable truth is this: you cannot chemically adjust yourself into loving a life that's fundamentally misaligned with who you are. You cannot serotonin in your way out of living someone else's dream. You cannot medicate away the soul's rebellion against its own betrayal. Today, we're going to explore why antidepressants, despite their legitimate biochemical effects, cannot resolve the deeper problem. The problem Jung called the unlived life. We're going to examine what happens when your psyche is screaming that something is catastrophically wrong, and how the greatest act of healing might not be to silence that scream, but finally to listen to it. Let me introduce you to someone. We'll call her Sarah, though she could be anyone. She's 34, has the career she was supposed to want: corporate marketing, decent salary, impressive title. She's in a relationship that looks good on paper. Her apartment is tastefully decorated. Her Instagram suggests a life of brunch and accomplishments. She takes 20 mg of Lexapro daily, and she feels like she's dying from the inside out. Sarah describes it as living behind glass. She can see life happening, can go through the motions, can smile at the right moments. The antidepressants have done their job in some ways. She no longer has panic attacks. The suicidal ideation has receded. She can function. But function is a haunting word, isn't it? Machines function. People are supposed to live. Here's what her doctor doesn't see in those 15-minute check-ins. Sarah chose marketing because her father said it was practical, abandoning her adolescent dream of environmental science. She stays in her relationship because leaving would mean admitting failure, facing the unknown, disappointing everyone. She lives in the city because that's where successful people live, though she dreams of mountains and silence. Every major life choice has been made by some other version of herself, a version trying desperately to be acceptable, safe, normal. The antidepressants aren't failing. They're doing exactly what they're designed to do: modulating neurotransmitters, adjusting brain chemistry, making an unbearable situation slightly more bearable. But here's the crucial insight: they cannot and will never make a wrong life feel right. This is the phenomenon psychiatrist R.D. Laing pointed to when he suggested that what we call mental illness might sometimes be a sane response to an insane situation. It's what existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard meant when he wrote about the sickness unto death: not a disease of the body or even the mind, but a disease of the self, a self that has lost itself. Think about the language we use around depression: treatment, resistant depression, as if the depression is being stubborn, refusing to respond to proper intervention. But what if certain depressions are treatment resistant because they're not biochemical problems seeking chemical solutions? What if they're existential problems demanding existential answers? Consider the fish in the wrong water. You can adjust its brain chemistry all you want, but if the fundamental environment is toxic, the fish will continue to suffer. The suffering isn't a malfunction, it's information. It's the organism's accurate perception that something is catastrophically wrong with its circumstances. This doesn't mean antidepressants are useless or harmful. In acute crises, they can be life-saving. They can provide the stability needed to do deeper work. They can correct genuine biochemical imbalances. But we've made a category error in modern psychiatry. We've mistaken the treatment of symptoms for the treatment of causes. We've confused making someone feel better with helping someone live authentically. The real mystery is why we find it so much easier to change our brain chemistry than to change our lives. Why we'd rather take a pill than admit we chose the wrong career. Why we'd rather adjust our neurotransmitters than confront the fact that we're living according to someone else's script. Why we pathologize the psyche as rebellion instead of honoring its wisdom. Sarah's depression is doing something crucial. It's refusing to let her live a lie. It's saying, in the only language available to it, "This is not your life. This is not who you are. Wake up." The depression is the soul's immune response to a foreign existence. The psyche is fever burning away false identities. But here's where it gets even more complex. Sarah has been on antidepressants for 6 years. She's tried 4 different medications, various dosages, combination therapies. Each adjustment provides temporary relief, then the heaviness returns. Her psychiatrist calls it partial response. What no one is asking is the more fundamental question. What if her psyche is partially responding because the medication is addressing only part of the problem, the neurochemistry, while the existential architecture of her life remains fundamentally wrong? The tragedy isn't that the medications don't work. The tragedy is that they work just well enough to make an inauthentic life tolerable. They function like anesthesia during surgery, necessary, helpful even. But no one would mistake anesthesia for healing. The healing comes from addressing what's actually broken. This is the problem that haunts millions, living in a medicated middle ground, functional enough to continue maintaining a life that slowly suffocates the soul, but never quite desperate enough to burn it all down and start over. The antidepressants become, paradoxically, enablers of slow spiritual death, not because they're bad medicine, but because they're being asked to solve the wrong problem. Carl Jung understood something that modern psychiatry has largely forgotten. The psyche has its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own ways of protecting and healing itself. What we call psychological symptoms are often the psyche's attempts at communication, at course correction, at preventing us from completing the ultimate betrayal, the betrayal of our own nature. Jung called this journey toward becoming who you truly are individuation. It's not about self-improvement or optimization. It's about self-discovery and self-honoring. It's the process of differentiating yourself from the collective, from the expectations that have been layered onto you since birth, from all the voices telling you who you should be. And here's what Jung recognized that's crucial to our discussion. Individuation is often initiated by crisis, by breakdown, by what feels like depression, but might be more accurately called awakening, painful, disorienting, necessary awakening. In Jungian terms, Sarah is experiencing what happens when the ego, the conscious sense of self, becomes too distant from the self, the deeper totality of who she actually is. She's constructed a life based entirely on what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear, the acceptable face we show the world. The corporate marketing professional, the good girlfriend, the successful urbanite, these are all persona identities. They're not necessarily false, but they're incomplete, and in Sarah's case, they've completely eclipsed her authentic nature. The depression is the self reasserting itself. It's the deeper psyche saying, "You've wandered too far from home. You're living in exile from yourself. Come back." Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The suffering isn't arbitrary, it's purposeful. It's the pain of the true self trying to break through the false self's carefully constructed defenses." Antidepressants, in this context, can sometimes function like painkillers during a necessary surgery. They might make the process more tolerable, but they cannot replace the surgery itself, the actual work of dismantling false identities and reclaiming authentic ones. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes essential. The shadow contains everything we've repressed, denied, or failed to develop in ourselves. For Sarah, her shadow holds the environmental scientist she never became, the mountained, welling hermit she never allowed herself to be, the woman who would choose passion over security, authenticity over approval. What makes depression particularly intractable in cases like Sarah's is that she's not just depressed. She's haunted by her unlived life. Jung believed the unlived life doesn't simply disappear. It remains in the unconscious, becoming what he called a complex, an emotionally charged constellation of repressed potential that exerts tremendous psychological force. Imagine carrying a parallel version of yourself everywhere you go, a ghost of who you might have been, what you might have done if you'd been braver, truer, more authentic. That ghost doesn't stay quiet. It manifests as restlessness, as inexplicable sadness, as the feeling that something crucial is missing even when, objectively, everything is fine. Jung observed that the psyche has a compensatory function. When consciousness becomes too one-sided, too identified with a particular attitude or way of being, the unconscious produces compensatory material dreams, symptoms, fantasies, attempting to restore balance. Sarah's depression is compensatory. Her conscious life is all achievement, productivity, socially acceptable choices. Her unconscious responds with lethargy, emptiness, the inability to care about these achievements compensating for the imbalance, trying to redirect her attention to what's been neglected. This is why she might have dreams of being lost in buildings with endless corridors, or drowning in deep water, or being trapped in spaces that are slowly shrinking. These aren't random neurons firing there, the psyche is symbolic language, showing her the truth of her situation. She is lost, she is drowning, she is trapped in a shrinking life. The Jungian approach to someone like Sarah wouldn't be to simply adjust medication until the symptoms subside. It would be to ask, what is this depression trying to tell you? What part of yourself have you abandoned? What unlived life is demanding to be lived? Where have you betrayed your own nature in service of collective expectations? Jung introduced the concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites, particularly when one attitude or way of being is pursued too extremely. Sarah has pursued safety, acceptability, conventional success to such an extreme that her psyche is transforming into its opposite rebellion. The desire to burn it all down, the pull toward radical change. This isn't pathology. It's the psyche's natural, self-regulating mechanism, attempting to prevent her from completing the journey away from herself. The individuation process Jung described isn't comfortable. It requires what he called holding the tension of the opposites, sitting with the conflict between who you've been and who you're becoming, between security and authenticity, between the life you've built and the life you're called to live. This tension is excruciating. Of course, people want to medicate it away. But the tension is precisely where transformation happens. Jung also spoke of what he called symbolic death, the death of an old identity, an old way of being. Many indigenous cultures have rituals around this, ceremonies that mark the death of who you were and the birth of who you're becoming. Modern Western culture has no such rituals. Instead, we have psychiatric diagnoses and prescription pads. We medicalize the death and rebirth process, trying to prevent the death part while still somehow expecting rebirth. For Sarah to truly heal, not just manage symptoms, but actually transform, she would need to undergo this symbolic death. The death of the persona that chose marketing over environmental science. The death of the self that stays in relationships out of fear rather than love. The death of the identity that equates success with others' approval. These deaths are terrifying, which is why the psyche's invitation to them often manifests as depression, the symbolic death arriving before the literal transformation. The crucial insight is this: antidepressants can make the dying more comfortable, but they cannot make you more alive. That requires a different kind of courage, the courage to actually change your life, not just your neurotransmitter levels. Jung believed deeply in the psyche's inherent drive toward wholeness, toward what he called the self with a capital S, the archetype of totality, the center of the personality that includes both conscious and unconscious. Depression, in this framework, is often the self's strategy for getting your attention, for preventing you from wandering even further into inauthenticity. It's not the enemy, it's the you've been misunderstanding. This doesn't mean Jung would have been anti-medication. He was, after all, a psychiatrist himself. But he understood that treating symptoms without addressing their source is like bailing water from a sinking ship without repairing the hole. At some point, you have to fix what's actually broken. The question becomes, what would it mean to honor the depression's message rather than simply silence it? What would it mean to see it not as a malfunction requiring chemical correction, but as information requiring courageous response? What would it mean to ask not, how do I feel better in this life, but what life am I being called to live? The existential philosophers understood what Jung intuited. There are some forms of suffering that aren't symptoms of disease, but signals of a life unlived. Friedrich Nietzsche, that prophet of psychological honesty, wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Sarah's problem isn't that her brain chemistry is wrong. It's that her why is missing. She's living a how without a why, a method without meaning, a structure without soul. Nietzsche also spoke of what he called herd morality, the tendency to adopt the values, choices, and life paths of the collective rather than forging your own. Sarah is living a herd life, the career that society values, the relationship that looks respectable, the lifestyle that photographs well. Nietzsche would say her depression is actually a sign of health, her authentic self rebelling against this borrowed existence, refusing to go quietly into the night of collective conformity. He wrote about the concept of amor fati, love of fate, the embrace of one's actual life rather than some idealized version. But here's the paradox: how can you love your fate when you're living someone else's? Sarah can't amor fati her way into loving a life that isn't hers. She would first need to claim her actual fate, her actual calling, her actual nature. And that might require destroying the life she's built on false foundations. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, explored what he called the sickness unto death, a despair that comes not from having something wrong with you, but from not being yourself. He identified different forms of despair: despair at not willing to be oneself, and despair at willing to be something one is not. Sarah is experiencing both simultaneously. She's in despair because she won't allow herself to be who she truly is. And she's in despair from trying to force herself into who she believes she should be. Kierkegaard wrote that the most common form of despair is not being who you are. This is the quiet, chronic despair of inauthenticity, not dramatic or acute, just a persistent, low-grade dying from the inside. No amount of sertraline can cure the despair of self-betrayal. That requires not chemical adjustment, but existential courage. The courage to leap into the unknown of your authentic life. The existentialists also introduced us to the concept of bad faith, living inauthentically, denying your freedom and responsibility, pretending you have no choice when in fact you do. Jean-Paul Sartre would say Sarah is living in bad faith. She tells herself she has to stay in marketing, has to maintain this relationship, has to keep up this lifestyle. But the truth that haunts her unconscious is more terrifying. She's free. She could leave. She could choose differently. She's responsible for her life, which means she's responsible for wasting it. This realization, that you are free, that you could choose differently, that you are responsible for your own self-betrayal, is often more destabilizing than the original depression. It's easier to believe you're sick, that your brain is broken, that you need medical intervention. The alternative, that you're spiritually oppressed by a life of your own making, demands not treatment but transformation. Eastern philosophy adds another dimension to this understanding. The Buddhist concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering but more accurately meaning unsatisfactoriness, points to a fundamental fact. When we live out of alignment with reality, with truth, with our authentic nature, we suffer. This isn't a punishment, it's natural law. A fish out of water suffers not because there's something wrong with the fish, but because it's in the wrong element. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks about leaning into discomfort rather than always seeking to escape it. What if Sarah's depression is meant to be uncomfortable? What if the discomfort is precisely what will finally motivate her to change? Antidepressants that make the situation tolerable might actually prevent the necessary crisis, the breakdown that precedes breakthrough. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, effortless action in harmony with one's true nature, suggests that when you're living authentically, life has a quality of flow. There's still effort, still challenge, but not the grinding, exhausting, soul-crushing effort of maintaining a false identity. Sarah's exhaustion isn't just from depression. It's from the massive expenditure of energy required to be someone she's not, every single day. Martin Heidegger introduced the concept of thrownness. We're thrown into existence without having chosen our initial circumstances, family, culture, or historical moment. But he also spoke of the possibility of authentic existence, taking ownership of your life, making choices that are genuinely yours rather than simply repeating inherited patterns. Sarah was thrown into a family that valued security over passion, practicality over meaning, but she's not condemned to simply reproduce these values. She can choose authentically, though this requires first acknowledging that she hasn't been. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir explored how we become complicit in our own oppression, particularly through conformity to social expectations. Sarah has become complicit in her own spiritual oppression. She's internalized the voices that say be practical, don't take risks, security matters most. And now she enforces these dictates on herself more effectively than anyone else could. The depression is her psyche's resistance movement, the part of her that refuses to be fully colonized. Albert Camus wrote about the absurd, the confrontation between human need for meaning and the universe's silence on the matter. He posed the fundamental philosophical question, why not suicide? His answer wasn't to pretend life has inherent meaning, but to create meaning through authentic engagement with existence. Sarah hasn't contemplated actual suicide, but she's committing what we might call slow spiritual suicide, killing herself off piece by piece, choice by inauthentic choice, until the walking corpse that remains barely resembles the person she might have been. The philosopher Paul Tillich spoke of the courage to be, the courage to exist authentically in the face of non-being, anxiety, and meaninglessness. This courage isn't something you take once. It's something you must take repeatedly in each authentic choice. Each moment you choose truth over comfort, self-honoring over self-betrayal. What all these philosophers point toward is a truth that modern psychiatry often misses. There are some forms of suffering that are appropriate responses to genuine problems. Not all pain is pathology. Sometimes pain is the appropriate response to a life that's fundamentally misaligned with your authentic nature. In those cases, the goal isn't to eliminate the pain, it's to address its source. So what does this actually look like in practice? How do you distinguish between depression that requires medical intervention and depression that's calling you toward transformation? First, you have to get radically honest with yourself. This is harder than it sounds. We're incredibly skilled at self-deception, at creating elaborate justifications for why we have to keep living the way we're living. You might notice yourself saying things like, I have to stay in this job, or I can't leave this relationship, or I have no choice. These absolute statements are usually signals. The truth is almost always, I'm choosing this job because changing careers is terrifying, or I'm staying in this relationship because being alone frightens me. The first step is recognizing that the depression might be trying to tell you something rather than simply being something to eliminate. Start asking different questions, not what's wrong with me, but what's wrong with my life, not how do I make this bearable, but what would it mean to live authentically? You might notice certain patterns. Maybe you feel slightly better on weekends, but it's not real relief. It's just temporary escape from the grinding wrongness of your weekday existence. Maybe you fantasize constantly about different lives, different choices, different versions of yourself. Maybe you feel most alive when you're doing things you consider hobbies, but never when doing your actual career. Pay attention to your body. The body keeps score in ways the conscious mind tries to ignore. Do you get tension headaches every Sunday evening as Monday approaches? Do you feel a physical weight on your chest when you think about your life 5 years from now on this same path? Do you experience a flutter of something, fear mixed with excitement, when you imagine making a dramatic change? These aren't random symptoms, they're intelligence. Your psyche and body are communicating what your rational mind refuses to acknowledge. But here's where it gets complicated. Recognizing that your life is wrong for you doesn't mean you should immediately blow everything up. The psyche doesn't work well with sudden, violent change forced by the ego. It needs something more like what Jung called active imagination, a dialogue between conscious and unconscious, a gradual process of discovery and integration. This might look like starting therapy that's not just about managing symptoms, but about exploring who you actually are versus who you've been trying to be. It might mean journal work where you write as your authentic self, the one who's been silenced. It might involve gradually making small choices that honor your true nature, even if those choices seem impractical or frightening. You don't necessarily quit your job tomorrow, but you might start taking evening classes in environmental science. You don't necessarily end your relationship immediately, but you might start having honest conversations about who you both actually are versus who you've been pretending to be. You don't necessarily move to the mountains tomorrow, but you might start spending weekends in nature, seeing how alive you feel there versus in your urban apartment. The process of transformation is rarely dramatic in the moment. It's usually gradual, though its cumulative effect is radical. You're not trying to become someone new, you're trying to stop being someone false. That's a crucial distinction. There will be resistance, both internal and external. Your rational mind will produce 1,000 reasons why you can't change. Your family might not understand. Your friends might feel abandoned or confused. Society doesn't really support radical authenticity. It supports functional conformity. You'll need tremendous courage to continue choosing yourself when everyone else is invested in you staying who you've been. This is also where the relationship with antidepressants gets nuanced. Some people need to stay on medication while they do this deeper work. The medication can provide stability while they make difficult changes. Others find that as they begin living more authentically, they naturally need less medication. The depression lifts not because of increased dosage, but because its source is being addressed. The warning signs that you're on the right path are paradoxical. You might feel more anxious as you start honoring yourself. Anxiety is often what happens when we stop following the script. You might experience grief for the years lost, for the person you never got to be. You might feel guilty. Guilt is the price of individuation in a culture that values conformity. These aren't signs you're failing, they're signs you're waking up. What you're looking for is a different quality of aliveness. Not happiness necessarily, not at first, but a sense that you're finally, genuinely engaging with your actual life rather than performing someone else's. A feeling that the depression is shifting from everything is meaningless to I can't keep living this particular life. That shift is crucial. The first is despair without direction. The second is the beginning of transformation. The integration isn't a destination. It's an ongoing practice of checking in with yourself, asking, is this choice honoring who I actually am or who I think I should be? It's developing the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of authenticity, which is almost always preferable to the slow death of inauthenticity. What happens when someone finally chooses themselves? What does the other side of this transformation look like? Sarah, our hypothetical but representative figure, doesn't quit everything overnight. But over the course of 2 years, through agonizing increments, she starts making different choices. She reduces her hours at work, accepting the income decrease. She ends the relationship that was built on fear rather than genuine connection. She moves out of the city to a smaller town near mountains. She volunteers with an environmental organization on weekends. Eventually, she returns to school part-time for environmental science. The depression doesn't disappear like flipping a switch, but it transforms. It becomes something else. There are still hard days, still grief for lost time, still anxiety about an uncertain future. But underneath it all is something new, something she'd almost forgotten existed, a sense of being alive in her own life. She describes it as the difference between watching a movie of someone else's life and actually living your own. She's no longer a spectator to her existence. The glass wall she described, that sense of being separated from life, has shattered. Not because a medication finally worked, but because she stopped living for the approval of people she didn't even respect, stopped chasing a version of success that meant nothing to her, stopped pretending. She tapers off the antidepressants under her doctor's supervision. Some days she wonders if she should go back on them. But she notices something. The suffering she experiences now feels different. It feels clean. It's the suffering of growth, of courage, of living authentically in an uncertain world. Not the suffocating, meaningless suffering of self-betrayal. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, not the elimination of struggle, but the hard, one alignment between who you are and how you live. It's the difference between suffering because you're broken and suffering because you're becoming whole. The transformation shows up in unexpected ways. She notices she sleeps differently, not the drugged sleep or the exhausted collapse, but actual rest. She dreams more vividly, and the dreams feel meaningful rather than just manifestations of anxiety. She laughs more easily. She cries more freely. Everything is more immediate, more real. There's a particular moment she remembers as a marker. She's hiking alone in the mountains, something she does most weekends now. She stops at a viewpoint, looking out over forested valleys, and realizes she hasn't thought about whether she should be there, whether this is productive, whether anyone would approve. She's just there, present, alive. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, she's not performing life. She's living it. This doesn't mean her life is easy now. She makes less money. She faces judgment from family who don't understand her choices. She sometimes feels lonely. The path of authenticity is often a lonely path, at least initially, but it's hers. And that makes all the difference. She still has moments of darkness, but they don't have the same quality of trapped, suffocating despair. When darkness comes now, she can ask it what it's trying to tell her, what adjustment she needs to make, what truth she's still avoiding. The depression transformed from enemy to teacher, from symptom to communication. What she gained was something no antidepressant could have given her, herself. Her actual life, the chance to die having lived, rather than die having only existed. So we return to where we began, that particular kind of despair that no pill can touch. The despair of the unlived life, the suffering of the soul in exile from itself. The truth we've been circling is both terrifying and liberating. You cannot medicate your way into an authentic life. You cannot chemically adjust yourself into loving an existence that fundamentally betrays who you are. The depression that comes from living someone else's dream cannot be cured by serotonin. It can only be addressed by the radical, terrifying, magnificent act of claiming your own life. This doesn't mean antidepressants are useless. They have their place, in crisis, in transition, when brain chemistry genuinely needs support. But we must stop mistaking symptom management for healing. We must stop pathologizing the psyche as wisdom, stop treating the soul's rebellion as a medical problem requiring pharmaceutical solutions. The depression might be the most honest thing about you. It might be the last part of you that's still fighting, still refusing to accept a fundamentally wrong life as normal. It might be, paradoxically, your hope. The hope that somewhere inside you, the real you still exists, still demands to be lived. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he knew this privilege comes at a cost. It requires the death of who you've been pretending to be. It demands courage most people never find. It asks you to trust that your authentic self is worth more than all the approval, security, and comfort you'll lose by claiming it. The question isn't, how do I fix my depression? The question is, what life am I being called to live? Your psyche already knows the answer. That's why you're suffering. The pain is the gap between who you are and how you're living. The transformation isn't about eliminating that pain. It's about having the courage to close that gap, regardless of cost. You are not broken, you're just living the wrong life. And somewhere deep inside, where no medication can reach. Your authentic self is waiting. Not patiently, not quietly, but waiting nonetheless. The only question remaining is, how much longer will you make it wait?